Hi there and welcome back. If you recall, in our last lesson, we downloaded Visual Studio Code and installed Visual Studio Code as well as the .NET Core SDK from the terminal within Visual Studio Code. And we created our first C# project and ran that project. And last time, when we ran our project, we did that all through the Visual Studio Code terminal. Well, in this lesson, I'd like to improve our development experience so that we can use the integrated debugger and take advantage of Intellisense in Visual Studio Code. So if you haven't already, go ahead and open up Visual Studio Code, and we're going to open a new terminal, and I want to change directory to my documents folder. That's where I've been creating my projects. So if I do an ls, I see my first app, which I created in the previous lesson. I'm going to run the .NET new command. I'm going to create a application of type console, and I want that to be output into my second app. So we see that the new console application was created. Now let's go up to our file menu and choose to open a folder. And I'm going to go into my documents folder, select my second app, and click OK. So in our Explorer pane over here, we see that we have an OBJ folder, a my second app CS proj file, which has some details about the project, and we have this program.cs file. So if you've worked with C# before, you know that for a console app, there's always a class called program, and within that class, there's a main method that begins that's the entry point where our code begins executing. I'm just going to change this to hello cloud and save that. And maybe we want to add something else. For example, maybe we want to prompt for some user input. Well, we could do console.readline, and you may not have noticed, but when I typed this out, I didn't get any Intellisense. So how can I resolve that? Well, it turns out we can install an extension. If we click this extension's icon, we see that I already have this C# extension recommended. I'm going to click that. This is C# for Visual Studio Code, powered by OmniSharp. So let's install that. And you'll notice it starts downloading our packages here. And it may take a few minutes for all of the packages to be downloaded. So I'm going to just pause the video right here while that works on that. Okay, so my extension finished installing. We see that it says finished here. You do want to make sure that that finished installing before you continue following along. Otherwise, the steps that I'm going to show you might not work correctly. So I can now close my extension tab and go back to my program.cs. And now let's see what happens. If I do console.read, you'll see that I'm now getting Intellisense. Well, that's a much nicer experience. For now, I'm just going to leave this with my single write line. And the next thing I want to try to do is I want to try to run this program within the IDE. So if I go over to my debug icon and I click that, I can see I have this little play button up here at the top, but it says that there's no configurations. So what we need to do in order to launch our application in the IDE is we need to add a new launch configuration. So I'll click add, and I'm going to choose .NET Core, and we'll see it creates this launch.json file. If I go back to, not that, I want to go back to my Explorer, and I see in this .vs code folder, it created this launch.json file. This launch.json file defines various launch configurations that we can use to launch our app. But if you'll notice, in the text of this file, it says the C# extension was unable to automatically decode the projects in the current workspace. So it really didn't set up my configuration like it needed to. And we're going to resolve this manually. So I'm going to grab some code that I already have. So I'm going to delete the contents of this launch.json, and I'm going to paste in some new contents here. And what we have is we have a version, which defines the version of this file. And then we have configurations, which is an array of launch configurations. We'll see that we can give our configuration a name, type, a request, and we have this pre-launch task, which is build. So that's what we would run before our application launches. The program defines the executable that our program will be output to, and I need to change this to my second app because this needs to match your project name. The other items here we can leave as they are for now, so let's save this. And now let's go back to our debugger, and we're going to see that in our drop down now we have our .NET Core launch console, which is the configuration we created. You'll see that that name matches this right here. So let's just hit our play button to try to debug. Well, now it says could not find the task build. Well, why is that? Well, it turns out we have to define our build task before we can launch. So let's hit configure task, and we need to create a tasks.json file. So choose this option that it is displaying here, create tasks.json file from template. And we want to choose the .NET Core option. So we'll see this creates a file for us, and we see we have multiple tasks. We can define multiple tasks. For our purposes, right now we're just going to have one task, and it's going to be called build. It's going to run the .NET build command, and we can pretty much use this file without any modifications. So I would note that this command could be something else, so anything you could run from the terminal could go right here. Now let's try saving this, and we're going to try running our application again. So in our debug console, we see that it built, it wrote out hello cloud, and we now have officially run our program using the IDE. So something else we might want to try to do is try running the debugger. And to do that, let's create a little bit more complicated example. So we're going to define a variable. We're going to call this variable name. We're just going to set that to an empty string for now. And instead of just writing out hello cloud, we're going to ask for your name. So we prompt for the name, and we're going to need a console.read line. And we don't need quotes there. And we need to assign this to our name variable. And the next thing we want to do is we want to write out an echo hello name. And I want to stop the execution of my program on this line so that I can check the contents of my name variable. So we can set a breakpoint by going over here into the left margin. You'll see it makes this red dot. Click that, and I now have a breakpoint set. All right, well, let's run our program and see what happens. But first, make sure you save it. You can do that by hitting Control S. Now we'll launch. We see we get our debug toolbar up here. In my debug console, you'll see it asks me enter your name and press enter. Well, if I highlight that, and if I press a key and hit enter, it does nothing. If I go over to my terminal, I can type things in, but it doesn't do anything there. So we have a problem. How do we get our user input? Well, if you encounter this issue, you need to go back to your launch.json, and we have this console parameter here, and I have it set to internal console. So instead of having this set to internal console, let's change this to integrated terminal and save that. And now let's run our project. First, I need to make sure and I stop the previous one because it was still running. So let's hit start. See, my build is executing. I have my terminal. So now you'll see that it's actually writing my output to the integrated terminal instead of the debug console. So now I can enter my name, Matt, hit enter. My breakpoint is hit up here in my program, so my execution stopped where I wanted it to. And you'll see that over here in my debug pane, I have my local variables listed, name equals Matt. I have a watch pane here. I could add a new watch, and if I put name in there, I add a watch and name is Matt. So that's how we can integrate and work with the debugger within Visual Studio Code. I can continue by hitting this continue button in the toolbar, and my code finished running. Something else that you can do, if you prefer to work with the Linux default terminal when you're debugging your programs, you could choose external terminal here, and you could run that. And now we have the default Linux terminal serving up the input and output of our program. So if I put in Matt here, then again it stops on my breakpoint, and I'll hit run. Of course, it instantly closes because the execution finished. So that concludes this lesson. You should now know how to install the C# extension and how to configure your launch.json and your initial build tasks. And we also looked at how you can configure which terminal your program uses by default.